The stallion stopped at the boarded mine entrance, refusing to move. When Sarah Clayton peered through the gap in the rotting planks, lamplight flickered inside where nothing should exist. The sound that followed made her heart stop, a child's cry echoing from depths that had been sealed for 20 years. The stallion stopped at the boarded mine entrance, refusing to move another step despite Sarah Clayton's urgings, and when she peered through the gap in the rotting planks, lamplight flickered inside where nothing should exist after 20 years of abandonment. The sound that followed made her heart stop, a child's cry echoing from depths that had been sealed since the cave-in of 1862 that killed 12 men, including the original claim owner whose ghost was said to still wander these canyons on moonless nights. Sarah had been tracking this wild paint stallion for 3 days through country so rough it tore her boots and left her canteen empty twice, driven by something she could not name, except that her late father had always said some horses were meant to teach you lessons if you were smart enough to follow. Her hands trembled as she tore at the weathered boards that crumbled like old bones under her calloused fingers, splinters driving deep into her palms as panic and curiosity warred in her chest over what could possibly be making those sounds in a tomb that should hold only collapsed tunnels and the remains of miners whose families never recovered their bodies. The boards gave way with a crack that echoed across the empty canyon, and Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening into darkness cut only by that impossible lamplight, her eyes adjusting slowly to reveal a sight that defied every assumption she had made about what waited inside. A young woman lay against the rock wall, maybe 19 years old, with dark hair plastered to her fevered face, clutching a baby boy perhaps 8 months old whose wails of hunger bounced off stone walls and filled the small chamber with desperation that made Sarah's throat tighten with recognition of suffering she had seen before in her own mirror during the hardest months after her mother died. The woman's calico dress was torn and caked with dried blood that looked black in the lamplight, her feet wrapped in shredded petticoats that barely concealed infected wounds, and scattered around her were supplies that told a story Sarah was only beginning to understand, as stolen blankets bearing the Triple M Ranch brand lay beside tins of beans, with their labels carefully torn away as if to hide their origin. A railroad lantern burned steadily on a flat rock, its presence as mysterious as everything else, since such equipment did not simply appear in sealed mines, and a leather satchel with the initials J.M. burned into its surface sat beside crumpled papers that Sarah's experienced eye recognized as legal documents, though she could not read their contents in the dim light. The young woman's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, fever-bright and filled with terror that went deeper than physical pain, and she whispered through cracked lips that barely moved with words that changed everything Sarah thought she understood about this discovery. "They're hunting us," the woman breathed, her hand tightening on the baby with desperate maternal protection, before her eyes rolled back and consciousness abandoned her completely, leaving Sarah alone with a crying infant and questions that multiplied faster than she could process them in the lamplight that should not exist. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Sarah made the split-second decision that would bind her fate to these strangers forever, her practical mind calculating that 3 hours to Doc Morrison meant survival, while 15 miles to her own ranch meant watching this young woman die in her arms. She grabbed the torn blanket that lay beside Lily and used it to strap the wailing baby against her chest, the fabric reeking of smoke and fear and desperation that told stories Sarah didn't yet understand but recognized in her bones as the smell of people running for their lives. Lily's dead weight proved almost more than Sarah could manage as she dragged the unconscious woman toward the mine entrance, her muscles straining with effort that reminded her of the summer she had helped her father move a fallen oak tree off the barn roof, inch by impossible inches, until the job was done through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The wild paint stallion stood perfectly still as Sarah emerged into the moonlight, and the horse's cooperation struck her as almost supernatural given that she had spent 3 days trying to get within 50 yards of this notoriously untouchable animal that every rancher in the territory had attempted and failed to catch. She managed to hoist Lily across the stallion's broad back, draping the woman's body like a sack of grain while keeping one hand on baby Thomas to prevent him from being crushed. And the horse accepted the burden without so much as a twitch of his ears, as if he understood the urgency of their situation in ways that defied natural animal behavior. The ride through darkness tested every skill Sarah had learned from her father, starting at age 8, when he first put her on a horse and told her that staying in the saddle was less about strength and more about balance and determination and refusing to let fear make your decisions. She kept Lily balanced with her left arm while her right hand supported Thomas against her chest, and twice during that endless journey she heard riders in the distance calling to each other in voices that carried threat even across the empty miles. The first time she heard hoofbeats approaching from the north, Sarah urged the stallion into a creek bed where they stood in cold water that soaked her boots while the riders passed within 100 yards, their torches creating dancing shadows that made her heart hammer against her ribs so hard she feared Thomas would wake and cry. The second encounter came closer still, forcing her to press herself and her charges flat against a rocky overhang, while 3 men rode past discussing search patterns and territories they needed to cover before dawn. And Sarah caught enough fragments of their conversation to understand that someone powerful wanted Lily found, and that the baby they mentioned was not being sought for his safety, but for reasons that made her skin crawl with protective fury. When she finally reached Doc Morrison's house on the edge of Silver Ridge, just before dawn, the elderly physician took one look at Lily's fevered face and infected feet and ushered them inside without questions, his experienced hands already checking for pulse and breathing, while his Chinese housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, took Thomas from Sarah's exhausted arms and began preparing goat's milk with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen desperate mothers and dying babies before and knew that speed mattered more than explanations. Over the next 36 hours, while Lily drifted in and out of fever dreams in Doc Morrison's back room, Sarah learned the true depth of the young woman's desperation from the physical evidence that Doc catalogued, with growing concern and a tightness around his eyes that spoke of secrets he wished he did not know. Lily's feet bore wounds consistent with walking over 30 miles barefoot after her horse died, the flesh torn and infected in patterns that suggested she had stumbled through rocky terrain without pause or care for her own body, driven by something more powerful than pain or exhaustion. Her hands showed rope burns on both wrists, angry red marks that suggested she had been restrained at some point and fought against those restraints, with enough violence to tear her own skin. And Sarah found herself wondering what kind of desperation made a woman injure herself trying to escape bonds that someone else had placed on her body. Faint bruises on Lily's upper arms matched the distinctive pattern of finger marks from someone gripping her with violent force, and Doc Morrison's weathered face grew darker as he examined them with the careful attention of a man who had seen such marks before and knew exactly what they meant about power and control and men who believed other human beings belonged to them like livestock. Doc Morrison had practiced medicine in Silver Ridge for 40 years and knew every family's secrets, had delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying, and kept his silence about things he saw that should never happen, but did anyway, because the law could not reach into every dark corner where cruelty made its home. He finally broke his professional silence when he examined an old scar on Lily's shoulder blade during the second day while changing the bandages on her feet, his fingers tracing the distinctive pattern of a branding iron, burn shaped like 3 interlocked M's that had healed years ago, but remained visible as raised tissue that told a story Doc did not want to believe. "That's Raymond Mercer's mark," Doc said quietly across Lily's sleeping form, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the truth more real than he could bear. "He brands his cattle with it, and rumour says he's branded other things he considers that his property, though I never wanted to believe those stories until this moment." Sarah felt ice water replace the blood in her veins as she understood the implications, understood that Lily had not just fled from Raymond Mercer, but had been marked by him like an animal, claimed and owned in ways that made Sarah's stomach turn with fury she had no outlet for yet. When Lily briefly regained consciousness that evening, as the sun painted the room in shades of dying light, she grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength, despite her weakness, and gasped words that confirmed every terrible suspicion forming in Sarah's mind. "Don't tell Sheriff Dalton," Lily whispered, through cracked lips that barely moved, her eyes wide with terror that went deeper than fever. "He's Raymond's cousin, and he'll take Thomas back to the ranch, and I'll never see my son again." The fever claimed her again before Sarah could respond, pulling Lily back down into the dreams that made her whimper and thrash. But the warning hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired, and Sarah understood with perfect clarity that she had stepped into something far more dangerous than a simple case of a lost woman needing help. While keeping vigil at Lily's bedside during those long hours when Doc Morrison slept and Mrs. Chen tended to other household matters, Sarah confronted the reality of her own precarious situation and why this stranger's plight resonated so deeply despite the enormous risks that involvement carried. Her father, Daniel Clayton, had died 6 months ago, after falling from a particularly stubborn mare he was trying to break, his neck snapping clean when he hit the corral fence in a way that left him conscious long enough to tell Sarah he loved her, before the light faded from his eyes and left her completely alone in the world. He had left her the Broken Creek Ranch mortgaged to the hilt with the Silver Ridge Bank, and Sarah was now 3 months behind on payments that seemed to grow larger every time she counted her meagre earnings from the back-breaking work that consumed her waking hours. She had learned horse breaking from her father, starting at age 8 after her mother died of fever, spending her childhood in corrals and pastures instead of kitchens and parlours, and she had built a reputation as the best bronc rider in the territory, with skills that matched or exceeded any man's ability to gentle wild horses into useful mounts. But being a woman meant that ranchers paid her half what the villa would pay a man for identical work, smiling apologetically as they handed over coins that represented weeks of danger and exhaustion, and Sarah had learned to swallow her anger and take what was offered, because refusing meant having nothing at all. The bank had scheduled an auction of her property in 6 weeks, and despite working 18-hour days breaking horses for neighbouring ranches, while trying to maintain her own small herd of 12 animals that represented her breeding stock and future, she was still $200 short of what she needed to keep her father's legacy alive. Looking at Lily's battered body in the narrow bed and baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in the borrowed cradle that Mrs. Chen had produced from some forgotten storage room, Sarah saw herself reflected in another woman, trapped by circumstances beyond her control, fighting against a system designed to break those without power or protection, or the accident of being born male in a world that measured worth by physical strength and legal authority. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from his deathbed, one of the last coherent things he said before the pain took his ability to form words. "Don't let anyone make you small, Sarah girl," he had whispered, while his calloused hand gripped hers with fading strength. "Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are 2 different trails, and you'll know which one to ride when the time comes, because your mother raised you right and I tried to finish the job she started." Sarah had not fully understood what he meant in that moment, too overwhelmed by grief and fear to process wisdom through the fog of loss. But watching Lily fight fever and Thomas reach for comfort from anyone who would hold him, she finally grasped the lesson her father had been trying to teach with his final breath. On the 3rd day, when Lily's fever finally broke and she could speak coherently for more than a few scattered moments, her story emerged in a voice raw with exhaustion and barely suppressed terror that made Sarah's blood run cold in ways the canyon winds never had. Lily had been the daughter of a failed homesteader named William Hayes, who lost everything to 3 years of drought and mounting debt, and at 17 she had accepted Raymond Mercer's son, Jacob's marriage proposal, thinking it would secure her dying father's medical care and give her a stable future away from the poverty that had defined her childhood. Jacob had been kind and gentle during their brief courtship, bringing her wildflowers and speaking softly about building a life together. But the wedding night revealed the truth when Raymond burst into their room without knocking to inspect his son's bride like purchased livestock, circling her while she stood frozen in her nightdress as he declared she had good breeding hips before leaving them both humiliated and shaken by the violation of that moment. Life at the Triple M Ranch became a waking nightmare of Raymond's controlling rage that started with small things like dictating what Lily wore and when she could leave the house, but grew into something darker after Thomas was born, and Raymond decided he would shape his grandson into a proper Mercer without interference from a weak mother who might fill this boy's head with softness. He flew into violent rages whenever Lily showed any independence or questioned his authority, and twice he had struck her hard enough to leave marks that took weeks to fade, while Jacob watched with tears streaming down his face but did nothing to stop his father's brutality. 6 weeks ago, everything changed when Lily overheard Raymond and his foreman Pike Sutton in the ranch office late at night discussing plans to handle 3 small ranchers who refused to sell their water rights, using phrases like accidental fires and unfortunate riding accidents that made it clear these were not idle threats, but planned murders they had committed before and would commit again. When Lily tried to tell Jacob what she had heard, desperately hoping her husband would finally stand against his father's evil and protect innocent families from being destroyed, Jacob admitted with tears in his eyes that Raymond had done this before, that the Mercer Empire was built on a foundation of intimidation and murder stretching back decades. He told her that people who crossed Raymond Mercer either fell in line and became complicit in his crimes, or disappeared into unmarked graves in the canyon country, where coyotes scattered their bones, and no one asked questions because asking questions about Raymond Mercer was how people ended up in those graves themselves, and Jacob's voice had broken completely as he confessed that he was too weak and too afraid to be the man she deserved, that his father had beaten all the courage out of him years ago and left only shame and cowardice where her spine should have been. Lily revealed that she knew in that terrible moment of Jacob's confession that she could not let Thomas grow up under Raymond's influence, could not let her son become another generation of Mercer cruelty, who learned that power meant hurting people, and that other human beings existed only to be used or destroyed. She began planning her escape with the careful patience of someone who understood that one mistake would cost her everything, that Raymond's reach extended throughout the territory, and that running without preparation meant dying slowly in the wilderness, or being dragged back to face punishment worse than death. She spent 2 weeks secretly gathering supplies in amounts so small they would not be noticed, stealing a single blanket from the linen closet one day, and 2 tins of beans from the pantry the next, hiding everything in the abandoned line shack on the eastern boundary of the Mercer property, where ranch hands rarely ventured because the roof leaked and the walls let in wind that made it useless for shelter. The night she finally ran, Raymond had ridden to Silver Ridge for a meeting with Sheriff Dalton and the bank president about expanding his control over water rights in the Northern Valley, and Jacob had drunk himself into his usual stupor trying to numb the guilt of his complicity in crimes he lacked the courage to stop or the strength to confess. Lily took more than just supplies when she fled through darkness that felt like freedom and terror combined in equal measure. She also grabbed a leather-bound ledger she had found in Raymond's safe while searching for travelling money. A book filled with columns of numbers and property descriptions and names that she did not fully understand but knew must be important given how carefully Raymond kept it locked away behind 3 inches of steel. She stole Raymond's fastest mare from the stable, a grey with Arabian blood that could run all day without tiring, and strapped Thomas to her chest with a shawl before riding east into wilderness with no clear destination except away from the Triple M and everything it represented. The mare died 3 days later after stepping in a prairie dog hole that shattered her front leg with a crack that echoed across the empty plains, forcing Lily to shoot the suffering animal with the pistol she had taken from Jacob's bureau drawer, and the sound of that gunshot felt like announcing her location to every search party Raymond Mand would send after his stolen property. She continued on foot with Thomas, and whatever supplies she could carry in the satchel and tied to her back, walking through days that blurred together in heat and nights that froze her bones, moving between abandoned buildings and caves and rock overhangs while listening constantly for the sound of pursuit that she knew was coming. She had been running for 6 weeks, always one step ahead of the search parties whose voices she could hear in the distance calling to each other as they combed the territory, until exhaustion and infected feet that left bloody prints on stone drove her to the desperate gamble of hiding in the sealed mine, where she prayed Raymond's men would never think to look for someone still breathing. When Lily produced the ledger from her satchel with hands that still trembled from fever weakness, Sarah and Doc Morrison spent an evening examining its contents by a lamplight, while Mrs. Chen watched over sleeping Thomas in the next room, and what they discovered transformed the situation from a simple case of a fleeing wife into evidence of 15 years of systematic criminal enterprise that could bring down the most powerful man in the territory. The ledger contained meticulous records of every illegal and acquisition Raymond Mercer had orchestrated, written in his own hand with the confident penmanship of a man who never imagined anyone would dare use his private accounts against him, and each page revealed new horrors that made Sarah's stomach turn with fury she had no immediate outlet for releasing. Burned-out homesteads were listed with the dates of the fires and amounts paid to the men who set them. Intimidation payments made to Sheriff Dalton and 3 county judges appeared in careful columns that showed years of corruption, and survey coordinates of water rights illegally claimed through forged documents were recorded alongside the names of the clerks who had been bribed to file false paperwork. The worst entries were 7 names of men who had disappeared after refusing to sell their properties, and beside each name were notes about where their bodies had been disposed in language so casual it might have been describing the burial of dead livestock, rather than human beings whose families still searched for them and prayed for their return. Doc Morrison's hands shook as he read entries about families he had treated, people he had buried after what were ruled accidental deaths by a sheriff who knew exactly what had happened, but chose to look the other way, and he realized he was holding proof that could hang Raymond Mercer and expose corruption that reached into half the county government. Sarah understood that this ledger represented power in its purest form, not just the power to escape Raymond's reach and keep Lily and Thomas safe, but the power to fight back and protect every small rancher, living in fear of the Triple M's ruthless expansion that had turned the territory into Raymond Mercer's personal kingdom where law meant nothing and might made all the rules that mattered. However, even as hope bloomed in her chest at the possibility of justice finally reaching a man who had operated above consequences for so long, they also recognized that possessing this evidence made them targets of a different and more dangerous sort, that Raymond would burn down half the territory to recover this book before it reached a judge outside his sphere of influence and control. Lily's testimony as a hysterical wife who had kidnapped her own child would not hold up in any court where Raymond's money and connections held sway, and without corroborating witnesses or additional proof to support the ledger's damning entries, a good lawyer could argue the book was a forgery created by a disturbed woman seeking revenge against the family that had given her everything, and the thought of Raymond walking free while they faced charges for theft and slander made Sarah's blood run cold with understanding of how thoroughly the system was designed to protect men like him. Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life when she announced to Doc Morrison and Lily that they were going to the Broken Creek Ranch where they would plan how to use the ledger properly, instead of just running from Raymond's reach like frightened rabbits who would eventually be caught and torn apart by hounds. Doc Morrison warned that harbouring Lily put Sarah's property at risk, that Raymond had the sheriff in his pocket and could manufacture legal reasons to search her ranch or worse, and that a woman alone with no family to back her claim would be easy prey for a man who had destroyed stronger people for less provocation than this. But Sarah's jaw set with the same stubborn determination her father had been famous for displaying when he believed something was right. That particular look that made neighbours shake their heads and say Daniel Clayton would argue with God himself if he thought the Almighty was being unfair. And she told Doc Morrison in a voice that brooked no argument that some things mattered more than property or safety, or the sensible path that led to survival without honour. The 3-day journey to Sarah's ranch became a bonding experience as the women travelled slowly to accommodate Lily's healing feet. With Thomas strapped to Sarah's back in a cradleboard she fashioned from willow branches and strips of leather cut from her spare saddlebags, while the wild paint stallion followed them like a guardian angel whose presence felt both natural and impossible. Lily revealed during the long hours of riding that she had been raised on a homestead and knew ranch work, that her father had taught her to handle cattle and mend fences and read weather signs before the drought broke him and took away everything except the knowledge he had passed to his daughter. Sarah recognized a kindred spirit in this young woman who refused to be a helpless victim despite everything she had endured, who spoke of livestock and land management with the competence of someone who had earned her knowledge through sweat and calluses rather than inheriting it as birthright, and by the second night when they camped under stars that felt close enough to touch, the women were finishing each other's sentences and sharing the comfortable silence of people who understood each other's wounds without needing every detail spoken aloud. When they finally reached the Broken Creek Ranch at sunset on the 3rd day, Lily saw the weathered 2-room cabin with its sagging porch that Sarah kept meaning to fix but never found time for, the leaning barn held together by hope and wire, and her father's stubborn insistence that anything built with honest labour could withstand another season, and corrals containing 12 horses that represented Sarah's entire livelihood and the thin line between independence and destitution. She understood in that moment, looking at this modest operation that was barely surviving against the pressure of debt and isolation, that Sarah was risking everything by offering sanctuary to a woman everyone believed was a kidnapper and thief. And the weight of that sacrifice settled on Lily's shoulders like a physical burden she swore Stanton she would find some way to repay. Over the next week, an unexpected partnership developed as Lily proved herself far more capable than her youth and recent ordeal would suggest, bringing skills to the Broken Creek that Sarah desperately needed, but had been managing without for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to have help. Lily took over the household management with quiet efficiency that transformed the cabin from a place Sarah merely slept between work sessions into something that felt like an actual home, cooking substantial meals from meagre supplies that somehow stretched further under her careful management than they ever had when Sarah grabbed cold beans straight from the tin. She mended clothes and tack that Sarah had been too exhausted to address, her stitches small and even from years of practice, and she cared for Thomas during daylight hours with a patience that allowed Sarah to focus entirely on the dangerous work of breaking broncs without worrying about an infant crying alone in the cabin. More surprisingly, Lily demonstrated genuine talent with livestock when she noticed one of Sarah's mares favouring her left front leg during evening feeding and correctly diagnosed an abscess that needed draining before it caused permanent lameness. her hands moving with confident knowledge as she showed Sarah exactly where to lance and how to pack the wound. The women established a rhythm where Sarah handled the dangerous work of breaking broncs during daylight, while Lily managed everything else, and evening meals became strategy sessions where they examined the ledger by lamplight and discussed how to weaponize its contents against Raymond Mercer without getting themselves killed in the process. Sarah taught Lily to shoot properly with her father's Winchester, recognizing that when Raymond's men inevitably came looking, both women would need to defend themselves rather than relying on Sarah alone to hold off multiple attackers. Lily had handled rifles before, but never with proper instruction, and Sarah patiently corrected her stance and breathing until she could hit targets at 50 yards with consistency that suggested natural talent waiting to be developed. During a quiet evening on the porch while Thomas slept and coyotes sang their lonely chorus in the distance, Lily confessed that she felt more alive and valued in this struggling ranch than she ever had wearing silk dresses at the Triple M, that being useful and necessary mattered more than being decorative and obedient ever could. Sarah admitted that having someone to come home to made the exhausting work feel less like survival and more like building something worth protecting, that she had not realized how lonely she had been until loneliness was replaced by partnership and the sound of another woman's voice in the cabin and a baby's laughter that made even the hardest days feel bearable. The confession hung between them in the darkness, and when Lily reached across the space separating their chairs to take Sarah's calloused hand in her own, neither woman pulled away from the comfort of that connection, or questioned what it might mean beyond the simple truth that they were stronger together than either had been alone. The fragile peace shattered on a Tuesday morning when Sarah returned from delivering a broken horse to the Morrison Ranch 5 miles west, and found 3 men on horseback circling her property with the deliberate movements of predators sizing up prey before the kill, led by Pike Sutton, Raymond Mercer's cold-eyed foreman who carried his authority like a loaded weapon always ready to discharge. They claimed to be searching for a disturbed woman who had kidnapped her own child and displayed a warrant signed by Sheriff Dalton authorizing search of any property in the county without need for additional cause or justification. Sarah positioned herself on her porch with her father's Winchester held casually across her arms but ready to shoulder and fire, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared they could see it through her shirt while she forced her voice to remain steady, and projected the confidence her father had always said was half the battle in any confrontation. Pike's eyes scanned the property with the methodical attention of a man trained to notice details that others missed. Noting the extra laundry hanging on the line that included garments too small to belong to Sarah's frame, and smoke rising from the cabin chimney in amounts that suggested more than one person cooking and heating water inside, his smile carried the promise of violence barely restrained by the thin veneer of legal authority, and Sarah recognized him as the kind of man who enjoyed causing pain and had found employment that let him indulge that enjoyment while calling it duty. Inside the cabin, Lily had hidden in the root cellar with Thomas the moment she heard unfamiliar horses approaching, following the plan they had rehearsed every morning for this exact scenario, and Sarah could only pray that Thomas would not cry or make sounds that would carry through the floorboards to betray their presence. She claimed she lived alone and had seen no travellers in the past 2 weeks, her voice steady despite the lie, but Pike did not believe her and made no effort to hide his skepticism as his gaze lingered on details that contradicted her story with the patience of a man who knew he held all the power in this exchange. Women's clothing too small to be Sarah's hung on the line beside dish towels that suggested multiple people eating meals, baby clothes were visible through the cabin window where they hung drying near the stove, and fresh tracks from horses other than Sarah's mare marked the yard in patterns that told stories about comings and goings she had not mentioned. Pike announced that he would be back with Sheriff Dalton and a proper search party within 2 days, giving Sarah time to reconsider her story before things got unpleasant. And the way he emphasized that final word made clear exactly what unpleasant meant in the vocabulary of men who worked for Raymond Mercer. He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of polite departure and turned his horse with movements that suggested he was in no hurry because he knew she had nowhere to run, that his employer's reach could not eventually find her. After Pike and his men rode away with backward glances that promised return and violence in equal measure, Sarah and Lily spent the next 36 hours transforming the Broken Creek Ranch into a defensible position while preparing for the confrontation that was now inevitable as sunrise following darkness. They moved supplies into the cabin, including every box of ammunition Sarah owned, barrels of water drawn from the well, and enough dried food to withstand a siege of several days if Raymond decided to starve them out rather than risk his men in a direct assault. They boarded up windows while leaving narrow gun ports that would allow them to fire while remaining protected. And Sarah taught Lily the sight lines and distances around their property that would matter if shooting started, pointing out which rocks and corrals provided cover, and which stretches of open ground would expose attackers to crossfire from the cabin's two sides. During the preparation while they hammered boards and stacked supplies, Lily made a confession that changed Sarah's understanding of their entire situation, her voice quiet but steady as she revealed truths she had been carrying alone for too long. Jacob Mercer had been secretly helping his wife plan her escape because he was dying of consumption and wanted to free her and Thomas from his father's control before his death left them completely at Raymond's mercy, with no one to shield them from the old man's cruelty. Jacob had told Lily about the ledger's existence and where Raymond kept it locked in the safe behind the painting of his dead wife, had given her the combination that only he and his father knew, and had made her promise to get the evidence to Federal Marshal Crawford in Denver, who Jacob believed was one of the few lawmen in the territory that Raymond's money and threats could not buy or intimidate. Jacob's death 2 weeks after Lily's escape had been ruled a suicide by Sheriff Dalton, who claimed the grieving husband had shot himself in despair over his wife's betrayal. But Lily believed with absolute certainty that Raymond had discovered his son's final act of defiance and murdered him, staging the scene to look self-inflicted while eliminating the last witness who might have corroborated her testimony. This revelation reframed everything Sarah thought she understood about the situation, transforming Lily from a fleeing wife into the keeper of a dying man's attempt to atone for a lifetime of complicity in his father's crimes, and her mission to reach Denver was not about revenge or even survival, but about honouring Jacob's final act of courage in a life defined by weakness and fear. Sarah realised as she listened to Lily's confession, while the sun set over their makeshift fortress, that they needed help beyond what two women could provide alone, no matter how well they shot or how carefully they prepared, that defending the ranch against Raymond's men was only buying time unless they could get the ledger to someone with actual authority to act on its damning contents and bring justice that neither woman could deliver through rifle barrels and stubborn determination. The night before Pike promised to return, Sarah and Lily sat together on the porch after Thomas finally fell asleep, and in the darkness lit only by stars and a sliver of moon that painted everything in shades of silver and shadow, they shared the kind of honest conversation that only comes when people face uncertain futures together and understand that tomorrow might take away the chance to speak truths that should not die unvoiced. Lily admitted that she was terrified not just of Raymond taking Thomas back to the Triple M, where he would be raised to become another generation of Mercer cruelty, but of being forced back into a life where she was treated as property instead of a person, where her thoughts and feelings mattered less than her ability to produce heirs and maintain appearances, and never question the men who controlled every aspect of her existence. Sarah confessed her own fears in a voice that shook with emotion she had kept locked away for months, that losing the ranch would mean losing the last connection to her father and her mother's memory, that she was so tired of fighting alone against a world that saw women as less capable simply because of their gender, and that she was starting to care about Lily and Thomas in ways that complicated the already dangerous situation, but felt more right than anything had in years. Lily reached across the space between their chairs and took Sarah's work-roughened hand in her own smaller one, her voice soft but certain, as she said that she had realised something important during this past week of working together, and building something neither woman could have managed alone. "I have never had a real friend before," Lily whispered into the darkness, "someone who sees me as I actually am and values that person instead of what I can provide them, or how I can be useful to their plans or ambitions." Sarah felt tears she had not allowed herself to shed since her father's funeral finally broke free and tracked down her cheeks, and she admitted that she had thought she wanted solitude after her father died, thought she needed to prove she could run this place alone and maintain her independence without relying on anyone else for help or companionship. "But having you here made me understand what I was actually missing," Sarah continued, her voice breaking on the words. "It was not solitude I needed, but partnership with someone who understands the struggle, who knows what it means to work until your hands bleed and still not be enough in the eyes of people who measure worth by standards we can never meet no matter how hard we try." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither woman fully understood, but both recognised as important and precious and worth protecting, even if neither could name exactly what it was they were feeling. When Lily leaned her head against Sarah's shoulder in the darkness, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like coming home after a long journey to find that home had been waiting all along in a place she never thought to look. At dawn on the day Pike promised to return, Sarah woke to find the wild paint stallion standing in her corral alongside her mares, his presence inexplicable given that the gate had been firmly latched the night before and the fence stood unbroken in every direction she could see. She approached the magnificent animal with the sunrise painting his coat in shades of gold and copper, and as she drew close enough to touch his shoulder, she noticed something tied to his mane with leather cord, a small pouch that had not been there when she last saw him 3 days ago. Inside the pouch was a folded letter sealed with red wax that bore no marking, and Sarah's hands trembled as she broke the seal, an unfolded paper that felt expensive and well cared for despite obvious age. The letter was from a man named Daniel Ravencrest, who identified himself as the rightful owner of the sealed mine where Sarah had found Lily, explaining that he had been living as a hermit in the high country for 20 years after being framed by Raymond Mercer for a murder he did not commit, and watching his entire life be destroyed by false testimony and manufactured evidence. Ravencrest had been watching Sarah's ranch for the past week, having followed her from the mine out of curiosity about who would help a stranger in desperate need, and he had been listening to Pike Sutton's threats from hiding in the nearby tree line, with his rifle ready to intervene if the situation turned violent. The letter explained that Ravencrest had been Raymond's original business partner before he witnessed Raymond murder a settler named Thomas Brennan over a land dispute, and when Ravencrest threatened to report the crime to territorial authorities, Raymond had arranged false evidence that made Ravencrest appear guilty of the murder instead, forcing him to flee into the wilderness or hang for a crime his partner committed. Ravencrest had spent 2 decades in hiding, presumed dead by everyone who had known him, but he still had evidence buried near the mine in a waterproof box, documents proving Raymond's original crimes and establishing a pattern of behaviour that would corroborate the ledger's entries and transform Lily's testimony from the accusations of a hysterical wife into part of a larger picture that no judge could ignore. The letter concluded with an offer that felt like salvation, arriving at the exact moment when hope seemed lost. If Sarah and Lily could reach the mine with the ledger, Ravencrest would guide them through hidden canyon trails that only he knew after 2 decades of exploring every crack and passage in that country, leading them to a railroad station 50 miles north where they could catch a train to Denver and Federal Marshal Crawford while bypassing all of Raymond's controlled territory and men completely. Sarah read the letter twice to ensure she understood correctly, then looked at the stallion who watched her with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for an animal, and she wondered if her father had been right when he used to say that some horses were sent by forces beyond human understanding to guide people toward the paths they were meant to walk. When Pike Sutton returned with 6 men and Sheriff Dalton mid-morning expecting confrontation, they found the Broken Creek Ranch apparently abandoned with the cabin empty, horses gone, and no signs of recent occupation except cold ashes in the fireplace and dishes still sitting on the table as if the inhabitants had simply vanished into air. What they did not know was that Sarah and Lily had left before dawn, while stars still filled the sky, riding hard for the mine with Thomas Stjabka strapped to Lily's back and the ledger secured in Sarah's saddlebag, while the wild paint stallion led them through terrain that would leave no clear trail for even the best tracker to follow. The journey took 2 grueling days as they pushed through canyons and over ridges that Sarah never knew existed despite growing up in this territory, following the stallion as he navigated routes that seemed impossible until they were through them, always staying ahead of pursuit. They could hear echoing through the rock formations behind them like thunder promising storms. They reached the sealed mine at sunset on the 2nd day, where Daniel Ravencrest emerged from the shadows, a weathered man of perhaps 50 with a grey beard and eyes that had seen too much sorrow, but still held determination that 20 years of hiding had not extinguished. He led them into the passages deeper in the mine that never collapsed, past the chamber where Sarah had found Lily, and into tunnels that descended into darkness before opening into a larger space where he had lived for 2 decades, surrounded by carefully preserved documents that chronicled Raymond Mercer's rise to power built on murder and theft and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. That night, while Thomas slept peacefully for the first time in days and they posted watches against discovery, Ravencrest and Sarah and Lily organised all the evidence into a comprehensive package that told a story no judge could ignore, combining the ledger with Ravencrest's original documents and witness statements he had collected over years of secret observation. The 3 of them worked by the lamplight, arranging papers in chronological order that showed pattern and intent, transforming scattered crimes into a narrative of calculated evil that had operated unchecked for decades. Ravencrest revealed one final piece of information that made Lily weep silently as she listened. Jacob Mercer had visited him secretly 3 months before his death, making the dangerous journey into the high country to seek advice about how to protect his wife and son from his father's reach. Jacob had known he was dying of consumption and that his death would leave Lily and Thomas completely vulnerable to Raymond's control, and he had died knowing that Ravencrest promised to help Lily if she ever made it to the mine and needed guidance to reach safety beyond Raymond's corrupted territory. Sarah watched Lily process this revelation and understood that Jacob's final act of courage had not been wasted, that his death had brought them the knowledge and allies they needed to finish what he started and bring justice to a man who thought himself above all earthly law. 3 months later, after Federal Marshal Crawford arrested Raymond Mercer and Sheriff Dalton and 11 other men on charges ranging from murder to fraud and conspiracy, Sarah stood on the porch of the Broken Creek Ranch, watching the sunrise paint her valleys in shades of promise rather than struggle, and the weight that had pressed on her shoulders for so long had finally lifted enough that she could breathe without feeling like the air was fighting her lungs. The bank auction had been cancelled after Marshal Crawford's investigation revealed that Raymond had been manipulating loan terms and foreclosure schedules to force small ranchers off their land, and Sarah's mortgage was restructured with fair terms she could actually meet through honest work rather than the impossible payments that had been designed to ensure her failure. Lily sat beside, with Thomas taking his first wobbling steps across the porch boards, laughing with delight each time he managed 3 steps before sitting down, hard on his padded bottom. And between the two women was a new partnership agreement drawn up by a Denver lawyer that made everything official in ways that mattered to courts and banks and the world that measured worth through legal documents. Lily owned half the Broken Creek now, her testimony against Raymond having freed her from that marriage completely, and secured her independence in ways she had never imagined possible during those dark years at the Triple M. Daniel Ravencrest had accepted their offer to work the ranch as foreman, his name cleared by the evidence he had preserved for 20 years, and his skill with horses proving invaluable as they expanded from 12 horses to a breeding program that was already generating regional interest from ranchers who wanted stock bred by the women who had brought down Raymond Mercer. The wild paint stallion, who they named Ghost for his mysterious ways, stood in the corral with a new foal at his side, finely gentled, but never truly tamed, a reminder that some things resist breaking and become more valuable for their wildness rather than their obedience. Sarah realized that what she thought she wanted 3 months ago when she first tracked that stallion through the canyons had been solitude and independence, but what she had actually been seeking without knowing it was an end to loneliness and isolation that had made every victory feel hollow, because there was no one to share it with who understood what it cost. What she had now was infinitely better than anything she had imagined when she placed advertisements for ranch hands she could not afford or lay awake calculating impossible numbers that never added up to survival. Partnership with someone who understood that strength came in many forms and that protecting what mattered sometimes meant accepting help instead of insisting on doing everything alone. The best ranches, like the best lives, were built by people working together towards something neither could achieve alone, and as Lily reached over to take her hand while Thomas laughed and Ghost nickered softly in the morning light, Sarah understood that the wild horse had led her to far more than a woman hiding in a mine. He had led her to the family she never knew she needed, and the future she never dared to hope she deserved.